Welcome to Lesson 3, Examples of Logic Models. You may want to take a moment during this introduction to adjust the volume on your computer so that you can hear the audio clearly. After viewing this presentation, you should understand how the components of a logic model can depict the alignment of your program's strategies and goals, the variety of forms logic models can take, and how to construct a logic model for your program or initiative. We have made some first steps towards utilizing logic models in Lesson 1, Introduction to Logic Models, and Lesson 2, Components of Logic Models. In this lesson, we will apply logic model components that you are now familiar with, the need, resources, strategies, outcomes, and goals, to more elaborate models. In Lesson 2, you were exposed to a basic logic model. While this version contains the key elements necessary to graphically align your efforts from the need to the long-term goal, the reality is that this graphic may be too simplistic for many of your initiatives. In Lesson 2, you also saw a logic model with 2 columns for short-term outcomes. This logic model would allow you to display an additional step within your process. Remember, short-term outcomes represent first changes expected in knowledge, skills, attitudes, or behavior. Thus, in this example, if you wanted to depict both training development and training provided to staff as separate steps with 2 distinct timelines, this version of the model would be useful. Additionally, this model separates resources and strategies to allow further elaboration of both components. By displaying the need and the resources at the top of the page, we are able to gain space within the model for additional details. This version also provides space for a brief description of the program or approach. Next, let's consider how we might structure a model to address the district's goal. WCPSS students will demonstrate high academic growth. By 2014, all students will graduate on time, prepared to compete globally. 2 necessary conditions have been identified to meet the district's goal: all students attending school and all students learning the curriculum. Imagine you are developing a program that will focus on students with excessive absences who have failed 1 or more courses needed for graduation. Your logic model might look like this graphic, with 2 sets of expected outcomes based on these key conditions. Ultimately, you have one goal, 100% graduation. But the 2 necessary conditions, students learning the curriculum and attending school regularly, are intermediate goals and thus signs that you are on your way to reaching your long-term goal. You can also add extra short-term, intermediate, and long-term columns if needed. Your first short-term column might focus on counts of teachers hired, teachers trained, classes implemented, and students recruited and participating, i.e. direct outputs of implementing planned activities, with the second column showing indicators of short-term outcomes related to student learning in the classroom and student attendance changes. Intermediate goals could relate to results on EOC tests, passing rates, and decreased percentages of students showing excessive absences. Depending on the length of your program service, the grade levels you are serving, and the level of risk your students face for not graduating, you may have to adjust your long-term goal to reflect an increase in graduation rates for this struggling set of students, or another measure available by the end of the program, perhaps a decrease in dropout rates. Labeling columns with a time frame is a good idea. Arrows are also used to indicate the relationship between the components and the order of events. In this example, both intermediate outcomes lead to one of the 2 long-term goals, achievement gaps closed, and this leads to all students graduating on time. Now that you have an understanding of the flexibility of logic models, it is time to review models that may look a bit more like your own. The next 4 logic model examples are each organized in a slightly different manner. When viewing these models, please note the variability of logic models provides. It is likely that your model will be unique as well. You will notice, however, that each model has a clear flow from the strategies to the short-term outcomes or outputs, to intermediate outcomes to long-term goals. This is an example of a logic model for a math tutoring program. At the top of the model, in the shaded blue box, the need that this program addresses is described. The next box has a brief description of the target group and tutoring program. In the first column, under the box shaded gray, the key strategies or activities are specified. There are two key strategies included: planning and providing tutoring. The arrow from planning to tutoring shows the order necessary for these events. Within each category, strategy, short-term, intermediate, outcomes, or long-term goals, there may or may not be order for each activity or outcome listed. If order is a factor, then arrows between boxes can be used to signify the order. There are a number of short-term outcomes included here. If our tutoring program is properly implemented, we would first expect to see teachers trained, programs established, and tutoring occurring. Once these activities take place, other short-term outcomes will occur. For instance, once teachers are trained, then teacher understanding of tutoring methods should increase, followed by teachers using these methods consistently. The intermediate outcomes or effects that you might expect to see are increase in student math knowledge on formative assessments, regular student attendance at tutoring sessions, and increased mastery on EOGs. These intermediate outcomes should then lead to the long-term goals, eliminating the achievement gap and having all students graduate on time. In this example, you will see that there is an additional column called Outputs. Again, this is a model preference, which shows the flexibility you have in displaying your logic model. Output may be used to indicate immediate changes that occur, usually expressed as counts and related to program implementation. In our tutoring example, the first column under short-term outcomes, teachers trained, programs established, and tutoring occurring, could have been labeled as outputs. Again, this is a matter of preference. Note that this would be a good initial model, but would require further specification, since the short-term outcomes indicate that skills will improve, but not by how much. The relationships and order of your activities and outcomes can be communicated by how you choose to group them. In other words, how do you separate them into boxes? And where you draw the arrows signifies how they are connected and ordered. You may feel it necessary to separate your activities into individual boxes if an activity only impacts on a particular outcome. In this example, the activities listed all impact on the 5 outputs, thus separating into multiple boxes is not necessary. Simply use your arrows to indicate these relationships. The last 2 examples were created using Inspiration software. See resources for the Inspiration website. However, you can also create a model using Word or Excel. This model was created using Word, and while the display has fewer graphic elements, the basic components are present. Remember, what is key is that your model is clearly displaying the order that activities and outcomes will occur. This model could be further strengthened by adding dates and specifying the degree of improvement expected. This final example is provided to show how a department's efforts might be depicted using a logic model. In this example, the activities of each departmental team is listed in a separate box. Arrows are used to connect these activities to the initial outputs, followed by short-term and intermediate outcomes and long-term goals. Grouping goals into fewer boxes shows alignment between departmental team efforts. The gray shaded box at the bottom of the page indicates how each team will monitor the success of their activities. By listing the possible data sources, this specifies the data used to determine if each team is on track towards accomplishing short-term outcomes, which will lead to intermediate outcomes and long-term goals. Templates and example logic models, including the ones shown in this lesson, are available on the resource page of the same Blackboard site from which you access this lesson. Congratulations! You now have an understanding of how the components of a logic model can be arranged to depict the alignment of your program's strategies and goals. Knowledge of the variety of forms logic models can take, and have the skills necessary to create a logic model for your program or initiative. We understand that it takes practice to move from knowledge to application, and we would be happy to review your drafted logic models and provide feedback. CPU credits can be gained by providing a drafted logic model. Instructor contact information is also available from the same Blackboard site that you access this presentation. Module 3, Evaluation Plans, the next module in the Monitoring Your Success series, will introduce you to evaluation plans, another useful tool in the monitoring process.